Thanks for that nice introduction, Andy. You know, as I was pulling together my talk, I was very cognizant of the fact that I am pulling, and I always pull from so many diverse literatures, in part because I have a nice diverse team of folks that I work with. One of my primary co-investigators is a sociologist and a cultural studies scholar, and he's introduced me to a lot of the more radical ways of thinking about people and communities and society, et cetera. And so, you know, it has to be a collaborative enterprise because, yeah, no one person can really be an expert in all of these. So I'm going to try to walk you through a bunch of different literatures so that you can see how some of the ideas that we've come up with for intervention have come about, and hopefully they make sense and will inspire us to do some deeper digging in our research and intervention work with kids that really appreciates their incredible, you know, spirit and grit, even though I don't really like that term. But it actually, it's very descriptive of a lot of kids who thrive despite growing up in very difficult circumstances. So here is an outline. If I can actually advance my slide, well, that'll be interesting. So here's just a quick and dirty outline. So first I want to spend a little time talking about redefining normal and rethinking deficits, or as I always want to call this talk, dump the deficit model, in fact. We'll talk about a little bit about hegemony theory. There goes my sociologist partner. And, you know, just thinking through how we think about what's good and right and normal and what that actually reflects. Then we'll talk about development in context, really visiting some modern developmental theory and developmental psychopathology theory that informs our work. And that's really, you know, exciting work being done in that space. Then we'll move on to talking about the stress response system and the importance of coping, given the stress response's kind of central and critical role in how we adapt to our life circumstances. Then pulling on some additional literatures to really identify or think about how we can identify existing strengths and assets within racially and ethnically diverse and low-income communities. And working class culture, for example, to really build up powerful intervention content that capitalizes on already existing strengths in communities and families and cultural rituals and practices. And then finally, talking about how we can increase agency, sense of purpose, belongingness via collective social action for kids who grow up in the context of poverty, who may be of different cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, but who can still band together to be a force for good. And so that I'll tell you about our intervention that strives to do that. Okay, so what is normal? How do we know what is good, correct, appropriate, right? Well, they are generally, we think about them as behaviors and ways of being that predict success, happiness, fulfillment, right? And behaviors that fall outside of that are what we term abnormal or deficient, wrong, even immoral in some circumstances. What I'm going to talk about from here on out is our, I think, newer way of thinking about development that's more about adaptation to context, that takes us away from deficit models, that perhaps deficit models, at least in terms of thinking about prevention, for example, which is the kind of intervention work I do, I think the deficit model is, it's done, in my opinion. It's time to move on and expand it. So in Western society, what is normal? Well, there are behaviors and ways of being that are actually aligned very nicely with white upper class culture. Personal wealth accumulation is really important. Other things often take second chair to that. It's very much, it's based in a capitalist ethos. And it is our cultural hegemony. Hegemony, which is, it means our common sense way, like it's just the way life is. You know, it's right to be capitalist. That's good. That's ethical. That's moral. Well, hegemony is actually is an ideology, and it's a cultural discourse that we have. Our institutions, our social structures, all tell us a story about how we are, and it's centered around the meritocracy idea that hard work and sacrifice is what it takes to be successful in life. And that supports the idea that our system of capitalism is just and valid, and that those at the top got there in a way that was fair and just, and that those who struggle and don't succeed, of course I can't see my slide because of the Zoom, but they must have failed. They didn't work hard enough. So it's their own fault. And the thing about the system is it obscures very real race, class, and gender inequities that are built into a capitalist system, you know, for better or worse. And hegemony, we don't notice it, right? So it's like if you're a fish. If you're swimming in the water, you were born in the water, you live in the water, that's all you do, you don't notice it. It's all around you. It just is. It's like our air that we breathe, right? If, however, you're trying to balance and teeter on top of that water, you see it. You see that it's water, and you see what it is. You notice that it's this thing that could swallow you up, and you could sink. And so if you don't fit into the status quo of our cultural hegemony, if you're a person of color or a poor person, you can see through the hegemony. And for us, that it's a system that fits really well for some people, but not for all. But it's presented and taken as a universal for all of us, right? Okay. So, okay, why am I talking about all this crazy stuff? Well, I think understanding that normal is culturally defined helps us understand our children in context better, and especially the development of children from marginalized groups, and really helps us interpret implications of our work and what to do with existing scholarship, for example. There we go. So current developmental theory and research really has shown that our development is experience dependent. You know, babies crawl through the world and encounter stuff that they have to respond to. And by doing so, they learn, they grow, they develop. And that development is actually shaped by the environment. So the things we encounter cause us to develop certain types of skills and abilities, and not other ones that we would have encountered had we traveled along a different developmental path, right? So experiential canalization is one of those modern developmental theories that I think lays out beautifully how this process works. That as a baby starts along their pathway of life, they encounter developmental challenges in the road, and the forks in the road that are available to a child are based in part on their, you know, what they bring to the table, their temperament, their genetics, etc. Prior development also determines which pathway a child will be encountering. And then, of course, current environmental circumstances as well. So here's our baby moving along. He's encountered a couple of things. Now he's at a new fork. And at that fork, there's some sort of challenge, opportunity, obstacle, something to which he or she will respond. And the response will determine then whether they go to the left branch or the right branch after successfully meeting that challenge. And there's our little baby, okay? Went on the right branch and now he's going up. And so this experience-dependent response really sets them along pathways. One pathway could have gone a different way had it been a different environment, had it been a different prior development, etc. And these responses, again, sort of at each junction, this constitutes our learning and our growth and our development. And I think they're hidden behind all you people. There's another baby who's just gone off on a different set of pathways because of their environmental circumstances or their temperament, etc. So developmental cascade theory adds further that these repeated developmental experiences of inputs and responses, et cetera, they accumulate and determine to some extent which pathways are actually available. You know, some are closed off for some kids. Some are, you know, some are opened to kids that we wouldn't necessarily want open to kids. So that past development informing future development is really critical here too. So what I'm talking about, these things that we're learning and the systems that are taking the input in and then responding to the environment, we're really talking about kind of the stress response systems, the, you know, physiologic as well as behavioral, emotional, cognitive. These are all the things that are developing in response to our environments. So I'm gonna, from here on out, probably talk a lot about skill sets. And what I'm talking about is all of those things that are shaped by our stress response system in response to the environment. Okay. And as we said, there's no one right pathway. There's a bunch of pathways that could lead to successful adulthood, right? Any of those branches, not any of those branches, but a lot of those branches can lead there. And what the traveling along the pathway does is it equips a child to function well in their future world. Well, which future world? The best, you know, our best evidence or prediction for a future world would be our past world. So the beauty and the curse, perhaps, of experience-dependent development is that our body is going to acquire skills and abilities well-suited to a future environment that looks a lot like the one we're in and have been in, right? So thinking about the different contexts in which kids develop, it makes sense that kids are going to develop skills that will equip them for, well, a technologically savvy society, for example, or an interdependent society where kids as young as 3 are gathering their own food and cooking it. My 12-year-old was rather impressed with this when I said, you know what, these kiddos, they gather 50% of their food, they light the fires and they cook it, and they're all under the age of 5. He was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Yes. Human development is amazing, and we develop, you know, there's so much plasticity there and the ability to develop incredible skills that match all kinds of environments. And this little guy in China, they don't even need diapers. They learn how to do their business appropriately very early on, apparently. And in a, you know, in an agricultural society where baby is with mama 24/7, that's going to enhance another set of capacities for positive development. Now, for the kids I work with in very high poverty urban contexts, these are kids growing up in dangerous, unpredictable, chaotic environments that are really quite fundamentally different from how a lot of middle-class white kids develop. So these kiddos, truly, they develop neural networks and structures, behavioral repertoires, ways of responding to the environment that are well-suited for operating in that context, in unpredictable, chaotic environments. And they won't necessarily develop behaviors that would support optimal functioning in a different kind of environment, right? So the ability to delay gratification, or the ability to develop trust in adults. These are things that they don't have, that aren't all that useful in that context. So within the appropriate context, our skill sets that we develop along our little pathways are valuable, useful, and survival enhancing. And the problem is it's not because they're not developing the right skills, it's the mismatch. So problems arise when one's contextually developed skill set doesn't match the other contexts in which we have to operate. And in modern society, we have to operate in multiple contexts. So our evolutionary biology is a little bit lagging behind in that it's really, you know, exquisitely tailored to function in one particular type of context. And we're stuck having to move around to all these different contexts. So just to summarize sort of what we've been talking about, development and context, it's not just deviant context. Actually, if you think back to what's normal is culturally defined, all of our behaviors are functionally adapted, including the ones that fit with our current hegemony, right? We wouldn't be very well equipped to be thrown into the hunter-gatherer tribe that I showed at the beginning. My kids at the age of 3 would not have been able to gather their own food. I can tell you that. And that there's not one right set of skills that just happens to fit with cultural hegemony. It's part of that system. I also don't think in terms of deficits, that these kids, you know, are not necessarily, they don't need to be fixed. In fact, those skills that they possess, they are not necessarily culturally valued in the hegemonic culture, but might they actually be useful if we appreciated them, if we figured out how to build on them, rather than just trying to unlearn them, have the kids unlearn these skills and learn new ones. So just, again, to put you in the context of the kids that I work with 10, 11, 12-year-olds in concentrated urban poverty setting, and these are the kinds of things they report on a regular basis. More than 50% of them are food insecure. They've all heard gunshots outside their home and school. There's a lot of gun violence in this community. They, you know, hassling by drug dealers, seeing dead bodies. An alarming number have had family members killed in gun violence, etc. So this is the context, and they're developing skills to deal with this crap, and it's serving them well. They're alive. In clinical work, sometimes we say that, right? Like, there's all kinds of wonderful outcomes, and sometimes just keeping a kid alive is a good outcome. Okay, so here's just a couple of goofy examples. So if you live in an environment where you don't know if there's going to be dinner on the table tonight, how would you do at this marshmallow test? Would you take what you can get when you get it, or would you show a nice ability to delay gratification? Well, of course not. Delay of gratification is not going to be useful in that setting. Similarly, if your experiences have been that adults sometimes mistreat you, and they fail to support you when you need it, would it be adaptive to trust adults and rely on them, or to never let yourself be vulnerable, to rely on yourself? Of course. So there are what Del Judas and colleagues call developmental trade-offs. So we develop abilities that match our environments and don't develop abilities that would be primarily useful in a different one. So what if we tried to capitalize on these differences instead of trying to remediate deficits? So there's not a lot of research out there identifying what poor kids are good at. It's mostly looking at what they're deficient in, but the few studies out there really have suggested that kids, you know, who grow up in poverty are have strengths in detecting patterns and changes in the environment. So they're good at detecting the signal in a whole bunch of noise. Makes sense, keep you safe in a scary, unpredictable environment. They're good at reading other people's emotions. They can, you know, notice the most minute suggestion that mom's about to get pissed off and she could become violent, for example. They're good at relating to others and aligning to a group that's trustworthy, like peers, not adults so much. And more inclined to seek out novel experiences, and so more risk-taking, more willing to go out on a limb and try something new. These are these are skills that we could perhaps think about building on instead of just remediating, right? So in terms of identifying skills to build on in interventions, there are 3 avenues that I think research can and should attend to. One, could the skills that poor kids do develop protect and enhance survival in other developmental contexts if kind of promoted and scaffolded in appropriate ways, and what additional skills might be needed to support that and to support success in multiple contexts. And then, what resources are available to help kids, because coping with the kind of stuff I just talked about, often it's tough to do it on your own. So one of the things we really think about are what are the people and the contexts and the communities that support kids and can really help them cope. And so we've looked and begun thinking a lot about collective coping, collaborative coping, ways for kids to get help in coping. So those are some areas for future research that we really think needs to be done. But I wasn't willing to wait for it to be done necessarily to develop interventions. So I looked outside of psychology or outside of clinical psychology in particular for ideas of things that we could, for 2 and 3, for example, that we could really build into an intervention. So starting with sociology, we looked into the literature on working class culture, and we found some really helpful scholarship there. There's not a ton, but there's been some really nice research done by Nicole Stevens and colleagues at Northwestern, for example, on the working class self. So people, or at least individuals who grow up in the context of uncertainty, unpredictability, limited influence that kind of comes with being working class, develops an interdependent sense of self. So the focus is not so much on my individual success, but on our success as a community, as a family, as a group. And so there's a strong commitment to family and community over the individual. Endurance, strength, hard work, optimism, these are kind of core working man values that we have kind of forgotten about in our culture, but they're really important ones and can be celebrated. And they also promote positive development in a number of ways and positive attributes and ways of being. And they can buffer against poverty-related health problems. They're related to more empathy, lower levels of narcissism and entitlement, more holistic thinking styles, more ethical and pro-social behavior. So there are some strengths there. And so we've certainly drawn from the scholarship on positive working class values in thinking about how to promote positive development in poor and working class kids. Then, of course, we sought out the literatures on racial and ethnic identity. There's been really wonderful scholarship on its ability to foster resilience in kids and adults facing discrimination, racism, and inequality, structural inequality. And some of the elements of that that we believe, elements of how strong identities protect kids is the pride in belonging to a group, and a group that validates one's experiences of difficulties, of struggle, as well as celebrates successes, and it provides scaffolding for individual agency. Further, for many non-white cultures, there's the emphasis on familism, religiosity, interdependence, And these really provide resources during times of trouble. And we think can serve as nuggets of collective coping, right? So that racial and ethnic identities are as much about the group as they are about the individual. And they really we could really pull upon those, build those potentially to build collective coping resources for kiddos. And especially important are the stories, practices, ideals, values that have guided past struggles and led to triumphs over adversity. So here my graphic is of storytelling, right, or the oral tradition. That's how we transmit our ideals and values, and also help kids see they're part of something bigger, that others have struggled and survived, etc. So, and they celebrate resilience, encourage agency. So we think, again, lots of reasons why cultural identity is a potential really strong protective factor for kiddos. And it leads into intersectionality theory, which is the idea that, you know, people are members of multiple social groups, some privileged, some not. And that perhaps we can search for areas in which we overlap with others, where and for example, for low-income kiddos, can they work side by side with children of other racial backgrounds, other religious backgrounds, to work towards a common solution for a common problem, like their neighborhood or their school, making it a little bit better. And so collective social action, we call it enacted intersectionality, because we encourage kids to cut across these identity categories, locate common ground, and work towards a common good. And in our work with the kiddos, we really have found it powerful in uniting kids regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, neighborhood. Okay. So empowerment theory and social justice have also guided our work. Social justice education, all the way back to Paulo Freire, emphasize that children's voices must be heard and their experiences validated. Skills teaching has to be done while also validating the difficulty and unfairness of the crap the kids have been dealing with. So often, at least my experience with, you know, preventive interventions and education is, yeah, I know you've had this difficult stuff happen to you, but you need to sit down and be quiet now. Where's that clinical dialectic of yes and? So in our work, we strive to say, yeah, we validate, damn, that sucks. That's not okay that you've had to deal with that. And, you know, let's figure out how to deal with that so that you can, you know, move on and not punch the other kid in the face, but maybe, you know, get some help for dealing with that. So we really strive for that, the validation and the dialectic of yes and. And empowerment theory and social justice education really suggests that our interventions should sow the seeds of transformation. So Freire was pretty adamant about our educational systems, and by extension, our interventions, can either sow the seeds of transformation or domestication. That when we just tell kids to sit down, be quiet, and deal with it, we're shutting them down. And that serves the hegemonic culture, but it's not serving kids very well, right? So we heed the call of social justice education empowerment theory that our interventions should actually sow the seeds of transformation, hear kids' voices, and have them be part of making their world a better place. So empowerment theory really suggests that collective social action is a way of coping with systemic stressors. So by connecting with others, learning how to participate, together, fosters individual agency, promotes belongingness, these really important core human values. And in order to do that, we have to meet kids where they are skills-wise. So instead of assuming they're simply deficient in problem solving and self-regulation, we meet them where they are, saying, wow, you have some pretty dope problem solving skills that work in this area. Well, they don't work so well in this other area, but how could we maybe tweak them a little bit so they do, right? So we meet them where they are, and then build on those pre-existing assets. And even, you know, grow a larger repertoire of assets and strengths. That's the idea behind what we're trying to do. Okay, woo. So that's where we got to this crazy logic model, which is our blueprint for an intervention. And it really just summarizes what I just talked about. And you can see it in the paper, and I'm not going to go through it, but you know, the idea is that there are necessary, you know, elements that need to go into an intervention. And for us, there are 3 core outputs that we built into our intervention in terms of skills, identity development, community action, in order to promote positive youth development and prevent psychopathology. So our intervention is called Building a Strong Identity and Coping Skills, Basics. It is designed to foster positive youth development, prevent depression, deviancy, substance abuse, bad stuff, alleviate the negative effects of poverty and discrimination, stress, and develop healthy coping skills, agentic, personal, and cultural and collective identity. I can't see my bullet points because of your pictures. But to build collective power, and the ultimate vehicle for that is youth-led community social action. And we target 6th graders because of their emerging cognitive development, the ability to develop more complex coping skills, and their increasing complexity of identity, their ability to think more complexly about identity, I should say. So they're kind of a ripe age. It's also a great age to make potentially transformative, lasting effects on the developing physiologic systems, because the stress response systems are in a newly plastic stage. So changes that we can make at this age can really take hold and be transformational going forward. So there's 3 pillars to our intervention: stress and coping, shocker, cultural identity development, and collective empowerment. Couple of notes about coping in the context of toxic stress or poverty-related stress, that functionally adapted coping remains necessary, right? So we're not going to magically transport these kids to live in a different environment. So we can't just undo their ability to be vigilant, their ability to act first and think later. Sometimes we can't just undo that stuff, right? So we need to balance, but recognizing that their skills for coping with non-toxic stress may well be underdeveloped. For example, functionally adapted coping is overgeneralized. So they punch first and ask questions later all the time, in school, not just in the neighborhood. And it's less useful in the classroom setting, right? And so we need to increase active coping options for non-toxic types of stress. It's important for them then clearly to be able to match, right? Okay, when do I punch first? When don't I? So we work on that. And it's critical to attend to their experiences of marginalization, unfair treatment, inequality. We validate their emotions, whatever they are: anger, outrage, sadness, anxiety. really validate those, but decouple their emotions from their actions, validate their experiences as being, awful, crappy, terrible. And they have a right to feel all those things. And we still got to sometimes make better choices, right? And so module 1 focuses on, these are the things we focus on in the stress and coping module. Educating about different types of stress. So there's everyday stressors like fights with your brother and school stress. And then there's major life events that happen to a lot of these kiddos. Exposure to violence and death and that sort of thing. And then there's societal stressors that are, kind of really outside of their individual and family context. So the fact that they're living in dilapidated, messy, dirty neighborhoods that look like a war zone, the places I work in. And we appropriately, link those to societal inequality, for kids to understand that some things are not just, individual. Then we work on emotion identification, because as clinical psychologists, we know that kids tend to know 3 emotions, especially kids who wind up with clinical problems, right? They're bad, they're sad, and happy. Those are the 3 kinds of emotions. So we try to expand that. We do a ton of different types of relaxation so that they can learn, self calming and in a variety of ways. We work really hard on problem solving and cognitive restructuring to give them just fundamental building blocks that they can use for this more complex stuff that we build in modules 2 and 3. You still, in order to be able to participate with other kids, you got to be able to stay calm. You got to be able to do some problem solving. So we feel like building those fundamental skills is really important. Then module 2, we zoom in on the cultural identity piece, and work on helping them understand who they are and who they come from and who their peeps are. And so really working, identifying whether it's their racial identity, their working class identity, what it is they really jive with, what their family narrative is, who they are, what their strengths are, where they come from. So the kinds of things we do in module 2, they go out into the community and identify assets in their community, things they like that are beautiful, that make them happy, and then of course stressors, the things that are awful that they would love to change, that they wish weren't there. And photo voice, you take pictures of those things, and then there's a variety of other things, you write about it or you discuss it. And what we did was we used some of those to really think about, what might they want to do if they were to go out and do a project to make something better. And so that gets us talking about ways to increase community assets and start thinking about a social action project. We also, in this module, work on their identity, and they do identity trees. There's a picture of one there where we have them think about who in their family, their community, etc., nourishes nourishes them. They're the branches, the kiddos are the branches, and the roots are the people who give them strength and who validate them and who nourish them. The people, the rituals, the cultural practices, etc., and have them really connect over that, and then talk with each other about the things in their root systems. And there's a lot of commonalities there, and ones that we as the adults wouldn't even have predicted. We had a group of kids who started bonding over their traditional foods that their families prepared. The child from Puerto Rico was describing this like really wonderful, stew that her family makes. And this other child whose family had origins in West Africa was talking about a similar stew and how much fun it was when they all cooked it together. And it was, they were connecting just in really beautiful ways, and able to kind of move beyond surface level differences, and more than just surface level differences, real differences, but to work together towards a common purpose. And then collective empowerment, module 3, is really putting that all together. Developing collaborative coping by working together. What we do is, as with social justice education, we bring scaffolding to the table, but the kids bring the ideas. They tell us what social problem they want to work on. They come up with the ideas for a social action project. We give them, tools. We give them a little bit of money to do it. We, make phone calls for them and whatnot, but they really develop the social action project on their own. They go out in the community. They work with community members. The idea is that they're in some way taking an action-oriented response to promote, to make their slice of the world a little better, a little safer, more beautiful, nicer, whatever. This helps build agency, belongingness, a sense of control, really important things that members of marginalized groups often suffer from. It also promotes the idea of you can't always do it alone, and that working together, even if you don't share obvious things in common, looking for ways that you can collaborate with others is a powerful response to structural inequality, for example. So we work on having them develop a group identity, combining their individual, strengths and assets, and come up with a community project to either reduce stress or build assets. And along the way, kids also learn about leadership and planning skills and budgeting even. They learn the tough lesson of not everybody can be in charge, and that, we build on each other's assets to make a group that actually accomplishes something. Here are some kids. This project was, they turned an abandoned lot into a park. They cleaned it up and painted picnic tables and planted some trees and whatnot. And they had a blast, and it was their idea. It was cool. So I think it's a good time to start moving towards wrapping up. So in terms of future directions for research, I sort of already talked about most of them. I think identifying strengths of kids growing up in poverty is critical. It'll require thinking, a little broadly about what are skills that are valuable. What skills do poor kids have that others might even benefit from? What resources are effective in helping poor kids cope with poverty-related stress and other types of stress? And how can kids enact collaborative coping? And I think, ways to promote intersectionality, intersectionality thinking for kids, so that I hate the word tolerance, but kind of more complex social identities and intersectional thinking, I think is a way of promoting better ways of being among kids in school settings, etc. So I'd like to see a lot more research on that. And then implications or research on intervention. I think, these are the ideas we came up with in reading all these different literatures and whatnot, but we could use more ideas on optimal ways to meet kids where they are and build on strengths. Like to see more clinical skills and prevention work, dialectics and validation, not just deficit fixing, but really yeah, not communicating to kids that they're not crazy, I think is a good thing. Yeah, there's probably more, but that's what breakout discussions are for. And so just some concluding thoughts that, you know, clearly a multifaceted approach is really needed to fully address the needs of kids in poverty. No one intervention or policy or program is going to make a difference. And I get it, you know, programs like Basics are one piece in what should be a multiple pronged approach, right? Income inequality programs. Yeah, but that, you know, programs like Basics, I think are important. Oh, because kids' voices, yeah, marginalized kids' voices, I think they're of value. They're an under-recognized, underutilized, their wisdom is under-recognized and underutilized, and may well, you know, provide solutions, new solutions to our world's pressing problems that we didn't think of. Those women in the hegemony have no, we just don't have those kinds of insights. So I think there's tremendous power there that we're missing out on by discounting poor kids and simply fixing their deficits. And that's probably as good a note to end on as any, I suppose.